This is a session with Harriet Fraad, and just check my, sorry, I'm getting my bio here on the, yes, okay. Harriet Fraad is a mental health counselor and hypnotherapist in practice in New York City. She is a founding member of the feminist movement and the journal Rethinking Marxism. For 40 years, she has been committed to transforming U.S. personal and political life. Part of Harriet's intellectual contribution is in the field of psychohistory. She proudly served as president of the International Psychohistorical Association for several years and published much of her work in the Journal of Psychohistory. She has a website at harrietfraad.com. Her current podcast is called Capitalism Hits Home. Her latest book, co-authored with Stephen Resnick and Richard Wolff and edited by Graham Cassano, is Class Struggle on the Home Front. She can be reached at hfraad@gmail.com. And her paper today is entitled Personal Life and the Fall of the American Empire. Harriet?
Okay, good. Well, according to all sorts of distinguished scholars and experts, and of course also the all-knowing Google that cites the US as a falling empire, this is what that means. Because first I want to talk about what does that mean, a falling empire, showing how well we qualify, and then, the effects on American personal life, on marriage and family and children of this decline. Now, according to all sorts of very prestigious scholars, if you want me to give names later, I will, at Google, this is what a falling empire means. First of all, it means economic strain. Not only the strain that Americans have, with 40% of Americans not having $400 in case of the worst emergency, but the bigger concerns about debt, not only personal debt, in which the US is swamped, but national debt. The US debt, our deficit, now exceeds our whole gross domestic product. The American debt reached 31.27 trillion over and again. Have a little drink. Over and against a 31.22 trillion gross domestic project. Now that's very, very hard if your debts exceed your income as a nation. America's credit rating was recently lowered from the very top to the second to the top, which is amazing. We're supposedly the richest country in the world. Another aspect of the declining empire is the weakening of our currency, the weakening of the dollar, because the dollar was the primary reserve currency with which all nations traded. That's changing. The BRICS nations now, BRICS standing for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and there are 5 others with 10 nations lining up to want to join BRIC. They're all transitioning away from the US dollar. And instead, they're paying in local currencies and in the Chinese yuan. And that is replacing the dollar slowly. Now, this is not inconsequential. The BRICS nations are the majority of the world's population who no longer trade exclusively in dollars. BRICS now has a special program, a pilot for a unit of currency that's 60% BRICS currencies and 40% gold. And that's designed for wholesale financial settlements. They're trying to create a gold-backed financial layer parallel to the US dollar. Now, since there are more than half of the world's population that are beginning to abandon the dollar, it's people all over the world. We have to remember people all over the world have, since the end of World War II, traded in dollars, which was the currency for trade, which meant that they believed that our pieces of green paper stood for enough that they could trade for goods, and the United States got products from all over the world in exchange for our currency. As our currency loses support, the products that we get from all over the world are now going to increase in value because the dollar is no longer what it was. That is a very important thing because it means the standard of living in the United States is deteriorating. If you look on the products you get, whether at the supermarket or at anywhere else, you'll see that they're usually from elsewhere. And people are stopping assuming that there's wealth behind those green dollars as our debt exceeds our GDP. Another characteristic of a declining empire is military overreach. And these are categories that are widely known and listed in Google. Maintaining an enormous military presence is now increasingly seen as a sign of desperate maintenance rather than unassailable strength. That's dangerous. The US has bases all over. And I'll talk about, we have between 750 and 800 military bases in at least 80 countries. And they cost between 55 and 80 billion a year to our taxpayers. Now, it's a wide range because there's so much cheating and fudging, it's hard to know. But we have 750 to 800 of these military bases. The second richest nation in the world, which is ascending fast, China, maintains one military base outside of its own territory, only one. And as the nations near Iran can see, the military bases are endangering rather than protecting them because they are being bombed. In another sign of US decline, the US has lost every war we fought. Sorry, need another drink. Since 1965. We lost in Vietnam. We lost in Iraq. We lost in Afghanistan. And now there's a lot of indications that we're losing our proxy wars in Iran and also in the Ukraine. That's a lot of losing. Now, all the nations that we have lost to are nations without even an Air Force, which makes the United States look a whole lot less dominating than it once was. Still, another characteristic of a declining empire is very strong geopolitical competition to US hegemony. Well, China is a very strong competitor. The Chinese economy has gotten greater, twice as big, twice as much as the United States for the last many years. The economic alliance of BRICS is bigger than the whole G7, which is dominated by the US. As I said before, the BRICS nations account for half the US population, about 4 to 4.5 billion people. That really does outnumber the G7, which is only 10% of the world's population. There's another factor that marks a US declining empire, and that's internal rot. Analysts point to a failing infrastructure, domestic social unrest, rampant corruption, and the inability to manage ecological crises and health crises with vaccines as indicators of an endangered system. The US lags far behind China, which is the leading country in green infrastructure like solar and wind power. We are far behind China in public transportation. China has 12 high-speed trains whizzing across its territory. The United States has none. That's amazing, considering that in 1950, 1947, really after World War II, China was one of the most backward nations in the world. It had a brutal invasion by Japan and a revolution. Now it's the second richest nation in the world and coming up daily. There's also, in terms of social rot, signs of deep social unrest here. One glaring such sign is the crisis of mass murder. For 2025, the last year that the data was in, we had 400 mass shootings, more than one every single day. Now, some other countries like Canada, Russia, and Finland have had some mass shootings. However, the frequency of mass shooting in the United States is between 4 and 10 times greater than anywhere else on Earth. 62% of all the fatalities from mass shootings in all the nations of the world occurred in the United States. To look at another marker of viability, health, Americans are dying younger every year, much faster than their peers in other wealthy nations. In addition, those deaths are driven by what are called, by Angus Deaton and Annie Case, deaths of despair. Those are drug deaths, alcohol deaths, and suicide. Those are avoidable deaths. Most US deaths were avoidable and are deaths by young adults, mainly males. A final indication of our failing empire is increasing social and economic inequality. US inequality has risen very steadily. The top 10% of Americans own half of US wealth, and the bottom half of all Americans own 6% of our wealth. Now, wealth is not only one's salary, but also wealth accumulated in the stock market, the bond market, and in housing. The top 10% in the United States own 93% of the stocks. And those are Congressional Budget Office figures. They're not some hopeful lefties trying to exaggerate. That's very impressive. Now, those are the people Trump is trying to keep happy. And those are the only ones, those top 10%. The crisis is particularly hitting American men. American men commit almost all of the mass shootings that are happening every day. And I should say that mass shootings are only counted if 4 or more people are shot. So, of course, there's many more shootings. They're just not 4 or more people. It's also men who make up the vast majority, 93 to 94% of all federal prisoners. Women account for 6 or 7%. And that gender disparity is true across all offenses. So it's important to notice how very well the United States is doing as a failing empire. The second part of what I want to talk about is, okay, how does that impact American personal life? Well, a huge part of American personal life And what has been America's safety net is family. And the legal definition of a family is people connected by birth, marriage, or adoption, a nuclear family or an extended family. Huge transformations have happened in the American families, occasioned by huge economic and political changes. What happened? Well, in the 1970s, fast jet travel, computers, and other inventions enabled American corporations and capitalist manufacturers to move millions and millions of mainly well-paid American unionized, often male jobs to poor countries with lower salaries like China, India, Pakistan. China's wages are 20% of what America's wages are. Indian and Pakistani wages are about 3% of what America's wages are. So millions and millions of well-paid, basically male jobs in manufacturing were lost for the purpose of greater corporate profit. In other countries, powerful left unions prevented that from happening. They forced laws against outsourcing in places like Scandinavia, also Germany and France. But American trade unions were enormously weakened by the Congress Un-American Activities Committee that decided that anyone who joined the Communist Party was committed to a treasonous, violent overthrow of the American government. There was no evidence for that, but it was maintained. Not only members of the Communist Party, but socialists and other leftists were condemned as traitors. They were deported, jailed, lost their jobs. Unfortunately, the United States AFL-CIO joined the anti-communist crusade and expelled the communists, socialists, and leftists from unions. Sadly, it was the left that were the most militant unionists. So the US went from 35% unionized in 1954 to what we have now, 9.9% unionized. So they didn't stop the outsourcing of millions of American well-paid male jobs. The reason that's particularly relevant to the family is because for more than 100 years, the mass of American families consisted of a wage-earning male and a dependent wife and children. Males worked outside the home. Females, marriage partners, worked inside the home, doing all the domestic labor, the social connection, the child rearing, and sex work as well. Well, when men's family wages were cut, women joined the labor force to sustain their lives. They entered en masse, and that was white women. Black women always had to work because in our racist country, Black men were never paid family wages as a group. Now, that was always the case. But that was at a time in 1974, for example, only 11.1% of Americans were people of color. That's changed. Wives working outside the home rebelled against a second shift of labor when they got home from their paying jobs. Husbands demanded extra care to compensate them for their lesser prestige as providers. The women's movement started in 1968-69, and it gave women a movement behind them as women demanded more respect and less of a double burden and a second shift at home. Divorces surged. I'll mention it later, but now 70% of couples end in either legal or informal separation or divorce. People had fewer children. Americans don't reproduce our population anymore. What was the family changed. Now about 70% of marriages end in legal or informal separation or divorce. The legal statistics are that 40 to 45% of first marriages, 60% of second marriages, and 73% of third marriages end in legal separation or divorce. Legal divorces cost between $10,000 and $20,000 a person on average. Legal separations cost between $2,000 and $5,000 a person. Even the legal do-it-yourself kits that you can get cost $500 to $1,000 a person. So a significant percentage of Americans don't have or want to spend that money. Remember, we're a country where 40% of people don't even have $400 in an emergency. So they make a decision to separate, and they make some kind of informal or at least non-legalized settlements and separate. That whole sector doesn't appear in statistics, but if we take into account that about 15% of people conservatively end their marriages that way, we have a figure of at least 70% of marriages end in separation or divorce. Pretty impressive. For the first time in our history, the majority of American women are single and by choice. There's a birth strike. In spite of Vice President Vance calling women without children dried up cat ladies, 47% of women say they can't have children because they don't have the money. They don't have the security. That's a little less than half. So what used to be the family of husband, wife, children has changed. The whole contours of personal life have changed. And that's very significant since the family was and still is, sadly, the US safety net and an intensely private affair. We don't have the maternity and paternity leaves, the paid vacation time, paid health care, universal free daycare, subsidized or free after-school programs and summer programs that many developed and some less developed countries have. For example, in Brazil, every family gets 6 weeks, every Brazilian gets 6 weeks of paid vacation time. We have none. The UNICEF made a report entitled "Where Do Rich Countries Stand on Daycare?" And they counted up 41 countries, some of which don't seem very rich, like Slovakia or Estonia or Latvia. And they compared these 41 countries on measures for children, like providing childcare and family support. The US ranks 40th out of 41 countries. 40th, only one country, Slovakia, provides less to its families than America does. So younger Americans don't have what families of the past did with lifelong commitments and children. The decline of the American empire means that jobs are not guaranteed or given for life with seniority. life is much more precarious. Traditional gender roles are changed by necessity because women are not supported as dependents in their home except for the 1%. And men and women don't have stable, secure jobs as they did when we were a manufacturing giant before we outsourced our manufacturing. Marriage and childbirth are steadily declining. The decline of the American empire and the transformation of former economic security to current economic precarity have transformed marriage, child rearing, and personal relationships in stable families, which used to be the foundation of American personal life. That is a powerful illustration of the power of political and economic forces. Sorry, I have a candy for my throat. Forces to transform personal life. That's what we're looking at in America now. You know, I have a young client, and she, wherever she goes, she rents everything because she knows the job won't last and she's got to fit everything she has in a car. The whole terrain has changed. And so that psychohistorians have to look at the impact of the economic and political transformations of the United States and our decline in terms of vast personal change. Okay, that's the end. If anybody has questions and we have time, I'd love to try to answer them.
Thank you. Thank you,
Sure.
Harriet.